There is a specific question that haunts the victims of financial fraud. It is whispered in courtrooms, typed in internet forums, and splashed across newspaper headlines. How could they be so stupid? When the public looks at the victims of Melissa Caddick, successful surgeons, corporate executives, seasoned business owners, and her own immediate family, they assume there must have been a collective lapse in judgment, a sudden, blinding rush of greed. But the official federal court records, the sworn affidavits of ASIC investigators, and the extensive findings of the NSW's coroner's court reveal a far more terrifying reality. Melissa Caddick's victims were not foolish. They were not uniquely greedy. They were methodically, psychologically, and systematically groomed over the course of 2 decades. This is not simply a true crime story about 23 million stolen dollars or a severed foot on a beach. It is a forensic autopsy of trust. It is the story of how a suburban administrator learned to weaponize human psychology, building an inescapable trap perfectly designed for the people who loved her most. To understand the architecture of this fraud, we cannot begin at the end. We must go back to the foundation. We must examine how Melissa Caddick forged her most successful, enduring creation, herself. This is false fiction. Melissa Louise Grimley was born on April 21, 1971. She grew up in Lugano, a quiet, unremarkable middle-class suburb in southern Sydney. Her upbringing was standard, comfortable, and entirely devoid of the immense aristocratic wealth she would later project. Following her graduation from Peakhurst High School, she did not attend an elite university. She enrolled in St. Patrick's College, a local business school, where she completed a standard secretarial and business administration course. She was trained to type, file, and manage office flow. She was trained to be the support staff, not the executive. But the factual record shows that very early on, Caddick decided that reality was simply a baseline from which to negotiate. According to later investigations into her background, Caddick began actively rewriting her history to match her ambition. On her professional resumes, she claimed to hold highly advanced academic qualifications, most notably a graduate diploma in finance and a Master of Business in Finance from the University of Technology Sydney, or UTS. This was not a minor embellishment, it was a calculated, foundational lie. When corporate investigators finally audited her life decades later, UTS confirmed the absolute truth. They had absolutely no record of a Melissa Grimley or Melissa Caddick ever completing any degree at their institution. From a psychological standpoint, this fabrication was her first successful deployment of what behavioural scientists call the forgery of authority. By claiming these degrees, she bypassed the years of grueling work required to earn them, instantly positioning herself as an intellectual superior in any room she entered. She learned that in the corporate world, if you project confidence and hand over a piece of paper that looks legitimate, very few people will call the university to verify it. The lie worked, and it emboldened her to test the boundaries of reality even further. By the late 1990s, armed with her manufactured credentials and a polished demeanour, Caddick secured a role in the investment division of the National Roads and Motorists Association, NRMA. It was administrative work, but it placed her adjacent to large sums of capital. Shortly after, she moved to a boutique investment bank in Sydney. It was here, in 1998, just 6 months into her tenure as an office administrator, that she executed her first documented financial crime. The crime itself was incredibly analog, lacking the sophisticated digital camouflage of her later Ponzi scheme. She simply forged her employer's signature on several company checks. The total amount she successfully misappropriated was relatively small, less than $2,000. In the multi-million-dollar context of the Malaver fraud, $2,000 is a rounding error. But psychologically, the events of 1998 were the most critical milestone of her entire life. It was a stress test for deception, and the results fundamentally rewired her understanding of consequence. When the partners of the firm discovered the forged checks, they confronted her, but they did not call the police. They did not file a report that would have resulted in a criminal conviction and permanently banned her from the financial services industry. Instead, they gave her an ultimatum: resign quietly and immediately, and the matter goes away. She took the offer and walked out the door. Why did the firm let her go? Because financial institutions abhor scandal. The partners did not want the administrative hassle, the legal fees, or the profound embarrassment of admitting to their clients that a junior clerk had effortlessly breached their internal security. Caddick walked away with a clean criminal record, but she also walked away with a highly dangerous piece of psychological data. She learned that intelligent, successful people are deeply averse to conflict. She realized that white-collar society will often choose a quiet, secret resolution over a public pursuit of justice. The 1998 forgery taught her that if you are caught crossing a boundary, the authorities won't necessarily destroy you. Society's natural instinct is to simply ask you to leave. It was the bedrock of her sociopathic confidence. She now believed that no matter how deep the lie, she could always slip out the back door before the handcuffs came out. In the year 2000, she married Tony Caddick, taking the surname that would eventually become globally infamous. Over the next decade, she worked aggressively to transition from administrative roles into actual financial advising. She joined Wise Financial Services, a prominent Sydney advisory firm operating as a subsidiary of the multinational banking giant ING. By borrowing funds, she purchased a 25% stake in the business for approximately $750,000. During this era, Melissa Caddick operated within the bounds of a legitimate, heavily regulated financial institution. She was highly effective at client acquisition, projecting an aura of absolute certainty. In 2003, her ability to project this success landed her on the cover of Independent Financial Advisor magazine. But behind the glossy magazine cover, a war was raging. ASIC enforces strict compliance frameworks on financial advisors. Wise Financial restricted its advisors on the types of assets they could recommend, strictly limiting exposure to high-risk property investments and volatile share classes to protect clients from devastating losses. Caddick despised these regulations. She chafed under the oversight, actively encouraging clients to invest outside the firm's approved parameters. When management intervened and audited her files, the relationship fractured beyond repair. Caddick was forced to depart Wise Financial Services. She negotiated an exit package, but it was not a windfall. She received her original $750,000 capital investment back and was required to sign a strict 5-year non-compete clause. She was professionally exiled from the Sydney advisory market. But in the affluent circles of Sydney's eastern suburbs, perception is reality. Caddick understood a powerful cognitive bias known as the halo effect, the human tendency for positive impressions of a person in one area to positively influence one's opinion in all other areas. If a person looks unimaginably wealthy, our brains automatically bypass critical thinking and assume they must be unimaginably smart, successful, and trustworthy. Caddick needed her social circle to view her as an untouchable titan of finance, not a frustrated advisor sidelined by compliance issues. So, she seeded a spectacular, audacious lie. According to testimonies gathered by liquidators years later, Caddick began telling acquaintances wildly different stories about her departure from Wise Financial. To some, she claimed her severance package was a staggering $86 million. To others, she hinted heavily at a massive, highly confidential, multi-million-dollar payout resulting from a sexual harassment claim against senior executives. Neither was true. But she knew that in polite society, no one asks a friend for bank statements to verify an $86 million payout, and no one presses for details on a traumatic sexual harassment settlement. The lies insulated her. They established absolute dominance. You do not question the financial acumen of a woman worth $86 million. You defer to her. She wasn't just building a reputation, she was building an impenetrable psychological armor that would soon allow her to steal millions without a single person asking to see the receipts. By 2010, Melissa Caddick had successfully negotiated the first phase of her grand illusion. She had exited her position at Wise Financial Services, weaponizing the halo effect to convince Sydney's elite that she was a wildly successful, fiercely independent financial titan holding an $86 million payout. But there was a catch. The 5-year non-compete clause she had signed meant she was legally barred from practicing her craft in Australia. The architect was fully formed, but she had no permit to build. Then came the physical exile. Her husband, Tony Caddick, accepted a lucrative career opportunity that required the family to relocate to Essex in the United Kingdom. For a woman whose entire identity was predicated on being the smartest, wealthiest, and most dominant figure in her social circle, the sprawling estates of Essex were not a sanctuary. They were a cage. She was stripped of her adoring Sydney audience. She was out of the workforce. She was, for the first time in a decade, financially dependent on her husband. Boredom, isolation, and a deep sociopathic need for control began to metastasize. And it was here, in the quiet English countryside, that Melissa Caddick executed an elaborate deception that proved she was perfectly capable of emotionally annihilating the people closest to her without a second thought. While living in the UK, Caddick maintained a desperate grip on her fabricated identity as a global financial heavyweight. In 2011, she told Tony that she needed to travel to Switzerland. The stated purpose was to attend an exclusive high-level wealth management conference to brush up on her skills and maintain her elite industry credentials. Tony, supporting his wife's ambitions, did not question it. But there was no conference. There were no financial seminars in Geneva or Zurich. The entire trip was a meticulously constructed lie. Instead, Caddick flew to Paris. There, she rendezvoused with Anthony Coletti, a Sydney hairdresser she had met before leaving Australia. According to the timeline pieced together later, Caddick had been secretly communicating with Coletti and had personally funded his international travel to meet her in France. When Tony Caddick eventually discovered the betrayal, he was devastated. He needed space to process the collapse of his marriage, so he temporarily left their Essex home to stay with relatives. In a healthy relationship, this is the moment for contrition, counseling, or an amicable, negotiated separation. But Melissa Caddick did not operate in the realm of empathy. She operated purely on control and self-preservation. As soon as Tony walked out the door, she initiated a scorched earth exit protocol. Recognizing that her marriage was over and her source of UK funding was compromised, Caddick did not wait for lawyers to draft a settlement. She struck immediately. While Tony was away, she drained their joint bank accounts. She packed up their belongings, took their young son, and boarded a flight back to Sydney. By the time Tony realized what was happening, his family, his wife, and his liquid capital were gone. But the financial theft was only half of the strategy. The truly devastating blow was psychological. Caddick knew that returning to Sydney as an unfaithful spouse would destroy her meticulously curated halo. In the affluent, judgmental circles of the eastern suburbs, reputation is currency. So, she employed a classic manipulative tactic known in psychology as DARVO: deny, attack, and reverse victim and offender. Before Tony could even communicate with their mutual friends in Australia, Caddick flooded the zone with a fabricated narrative. She told everyone, her friends, her family, her professional contacts, that Tony had been incredibly controlling, manipulative, and abusive. She cast her midnight escape from the UK not as the flight of a deceitful spouse, but as the desperate survival tactic of a terrified mother. The lie was absolute. It insulated her from criticism, garnered her immense sympathy, and effectively excommunicated Tony Caddick from their shared social circle before he could ever defend himself. She had just successfully beta-tested her ability to construct a false reality and force educated, intelligent people to believe it. It was the perfect psychological warm-up for what she was about to do next. Melissa Caddick returned to Sydney in 2012, entirely reinvented. She was now a wealthy, resilient single mother who had survived a difficult marriage. Her 5-year non-compete clause had finally expired. She was free to operate, and she was hungry to reclaim her throne. By 2013, she had married Anthony Coletti. With her personal life secured, she turned her attention to her masterpiece. On June 19, 2013, she formally incorporated a company. She named it Malava Praitittai Limited. The Federal Court of Australia would later rule unequivocally that from its very first day of existence, Malava was a sham or facade. It was not a registered brokerage. It had no compliance officers. It was nothing more than a corporate shell designed to capture millions of dollars. But a shell company alone isn't enough to run a Ponzi scheme. To convince highly skeptical, high-net-worth individuals to hand over their life savings, you need the ultimate psychological prop: government validation. In Australia, the law mandates that any individual or entity providing financial advice or managing client funds must hold an Australian Financial Services Licence, AFSL, issued by the Australian Securities and Investments Commission, ASIC. Obtaining an AFSL is deliberately difficult. It requires exhaustive background checks, stringent financial audits, and a massive ongoing compliance infrastructure. Caddick didn't have the patience, the capital, or the clean record required to get one. So, in the defining criminal act of her career, she bypassed the system entirely. Caddick looked to her past. She remembered Jennifer Porter, a highly respected former colleague from her days at Wise Financial. Porter had successfully gone independent and legally obtained her own AFSL for her legitimate business. Caddick pulled Porter's 6-digit AFSL number from public registries. Without Porter's knowledge, permission, or oversight, Caddick claimed the number as her own. She embedded the stolen AFSL number onto the back page of every piece of Malava stationery. It was printed on her email signatures, her glossy pitch decks, and her leather-bound investment prospectuses. This stolen 6-digit number was the psychological skeleton key to the entire fraud. When a prospective investor, whether a seasoned business owner or her own brother, sat across from her, they were looking for red flags. But Caddick gave them none. They saw the expensive Dior clothing, they saw the Dover Heights address, and when they reached the end of her flawless presentation, they saw the government-issued AFSL number. In the human brain, visual confirmation often overrides critical analysis. The presence of the AFSL number signaled that a higher authority, the Australian government, had already vetted Melissa Caddick. It signaled that she was safe. She bet her entire freedom on one terrifying assumption: that out of all the brilliant, wealthy people in her inner circle, not a single one would actually log on to the ASIC registry and verify who that number belonged to. It was a staggering gamble, and for the next 7 years, it paid out flawlessly. The trap was now fully constructed, baited, and ready for its first victims. By late 2013, Melissa Caddick had assembled the machinery of her fraud. She had a corporate shell in Malava Praitittai Limited. She had the psychological armor of her fabricated $86 million payout. And, most crucially, she had the stolen 6-digit Australian Financial Services Licence number to project the illusion of intense government oversight. But a Ponzi scheme is a living, breathing entity. It requires constant nourishment. It cannot survive in a vacuum. It needs a continuous inflow of fresh capital to sustain the illusion of growth. To acquire that capital, Caddick needed to prove to her prospective investors that she was a financial savant capable of beating the market. She had to show them the numbers. And so, she turned to the most devastatingly effective, yet brutally simple, tool in her entire arsenal: the paper pacifier. When investigators from the Australian Securities and Investments Commission, ASIC, and court-appointed liquidators from Jones Partners eventually dismantled Malava, they braced themselves to untangle a web of complex offshore accounts, algorithmic trading losses, and sophisticated financial instruments. Instead, they found a complete void. Bruce Gleason, the lead receiver, would later confirm the most staggering fact of the entire investigation. Of the estimated $23 to $30 million handed over to Melissa Caddick, not a single cent was ever invested in the share market. Not one share of a blue-chip stock was purchased. So, how did highly educated investors believe their portfolios were thriving for 7 years? Caddick weaponized their trust using basic desktop publishing software. She utilized legitimate Commonwealth Bank securities, or COMSEC, templates. When a client deposited $500,000 directly into a bank account she solely controlled, a massive red flag in traditional finance, where funds should go to an independent custodian, she immediately went to work on her computer. She manually typed the client's name onto the template. She invented a portfolio of high-performing stocks, and then she simply typed in a fake balance, showing immediate, impossible upward trajectories. She consistently manufactured returns of 10% to 15% year after year, completely ignoring the actual fluctuations of the global market. She would print these flawless, multi-page COMSEC documents, bind them beautifully, and hand them to her victims. From a psychological standpoint, this was a masterstroke of manipulation. The forged statement acted as a pacifier. It satiated the investor's anxiety. When they looked at the official-sounding document, their greed validated their initial trust. The paper became their reality. Caddick knew that human beings are fundamentally complacent when they believe they are winning. Not a single investor ever picked up the phone, called the Commonwealth Bank, and read out their account number to verify the balance. The illusion of success was simply too intoxicating to question. With the fake documents perfecting the illusion, Caddick needed to select her targets. A traditional financial fraudster casts a wide net. They run advertisements, cold call retirees, and host lavish public seminars to drum up capital. But Caddick understood that going public meant inviting public scrutiny. If she pitched a stranger, that stranger might ask their own accountant to review her prospectus. That would mean instant exposure. To keep the loop completely closed, she had to target people who would consider an audit to be a personal insult. She had to target love. She focused her crosshairs almost entirely on her inner circle, her closest friends, her extended family, her brother, and eventually, her own parents. She actively transformed her Ponzi scheme into an exclusive VIP club. She manufactured scarcity. When a friend at a dinner party, dazzled by Caddick's apparent wealth, expressed interest in investing, Caddick would not immediately say yes. She would hesitate. She would tell them that her books were technically closed, that she only managed money for a select few high-net-worth clients, and that she was doing them a massive favor by letting them in. She made her victims beg her to take their life savings. This psychological grooming was absolute. By allowing them past the velvet rope, she created a profound sense of gratitude in her victims. They felt privileged. And in Caddick's carefully constructed ecosystem, to question her methodology or to ask to withdraw funds wasn't just a financial transaction, it was a betrayal of her generosity. She weaponized their intimacy, turning their love and loyalty into a shield against regulatory scrutiny. The final piece of the trap was the physical environment. To maintain the halo effect, the belief that she was an infallible financial genius, she had to provide constant visual proof of her success. The $23 million flowing into her accounts wasn't just being hoarded, it was being incinerated to fuel a hyper-luxurious lifestyle. Caddick purchased a $6 million multi-level mansion on Wallangra Road in Dover Heights, featuring an elevator, a pool, and sweeping views of the Sydney skyline. She drove luxury vehicles. She spent an estimated $2 million on Christian Dior apparel, Chanel handbags, and bespoke Canturi diamonds. She routinely flew her friends and investors first class to Aspen, Colorado, for all expenses paid ski trips. To the outside world, this looked like the grotesque, unchecked greed of a sociopath. But within the mechanics of the fraud, this spending served a highly specific, tactical purpose. It was her marketing budget. When a victim sat in her Dover Heights living room, surrounded by millions of dollars of tangible wealth, their brain registered safety. The mansion and the diamonds were physical proof that her financial strategies worked. They reasoned, if she is making this much money for herself, she can make it for me. Every Dior dress, every first-class ticket, and every lavish dinner party was paid for with stolen money, designed specifically to lure in the next $1 million deposit. By 2019, the Malaver machine was operating at its absolute peak. Melissa Caddick was managing an estimated $23 to $30 million of phantom capital. She had successfully insulated herself from the outside world, surrounded only by compliant, adoring victims who believed she was making them incredibly wealthy. But a Ponzi scheme is a ticking clock. And as 2019 rolled into 2020, the pressure to maintain the lie was beginning to warp the architect's mind. The trap was perfect, but the predator was about to make her first fatal mistake. There is a fundamental law of physics that applies to financial fraud. A closed system requires a constant, exhausting input of energy to prevent total collapse. By 2019, Melissa Caddick had built the perfect psychological trap. She was managing an estimated $23 to $30 million in stolen capital. She was revered by her friends, adored by her family, and entirely insulated by a wall of high-end luxury. But the Malaver machine was not a passive investment. It was a manual, analog deception. Every single month, Caddick had to sit at her computer and physically manufacture the illusion of success. She had to manually track dozens of investors, forge their ComSec statements, fabricate stock market returns, and cross-reference her own lies to ensure no two documents contradicted each other. It was an administrative nightmare. And as the years ground on, the psychological toll of maintaining this multi-million-dollar fiction began to warp the architect. The predator was growing tired, and with fatigue comes paranoia. To understand how the paranoia manifested, we have to look inside the Dover Heights mansion, specifically at the dynamic between Melissa Caddick and her second husband, Anthony Coletti. Since the raid in 2020, the Australian public has been obsessed with a single question regarding Coletti. How could he not know? How could a man live in a $6 million house, drive a $300,000 Audi R8, and wear designer watches without realizing his wife was running a massive Ponzi scheme from her home office? The coronial inquest investigated this thoroughly. While Deputy State Coroner Elizabeth Ryan found Coletti's later evidence regarding his wife's disappearance to be inconsistent and unreliable, there was no factual evidence to suggest he was a co-conspirator in the fraud. The psychological explanation for his ignorance is far more chilling. He didn't know because Melissa Caddick deliberately engineered him not to know. Coletti, a former hairdresser and part-time DJ, was entirely financially dependent on his wife. Caddick controlled every cent that flowed through the household. She paid the bills, she bought the cars, and she dictated the lifestyle. In the ecosystem of her fraud, Coletti was not a partner, he was an asset. He was a crucial piece of her marketing budget. By keeping him blissfully ignorant, she ensured his genuine belief in her success. When investors came to the house, Coletti's authentic, unfeigned admiration for his genius wife provided the ultimate character reference. Caddick compartmentalized her life with sociopathic precision. She built a firewall down the center of her marriage, maintaining absolute, authoritarian control over the narrative inside her own home. But maintaining that firewall was exhausting. In early 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic triggered a massive, violent contraction in the global stock market. For legitimate financial advisors, this was a period of intense crisis management, talking clients through devastating portfolio losses. For Melissa Caddick, it was an existential threat. In a Ponzi scheme, a market crash is terrifying, not because the fraudster loses money. Remember, Caddick had absolutely zero capital actually invested in the market, but because economic panic makes investors want to cash out. If multiple victims suddenly asked to withdraw their millions to buy property or survive the economic downturn, The Malaver accounts would instantly run dry. The Ponzi would implode. To prevent a run on the bank, Caddick had to double down on her deception. While the actual Australian stock market was bleeding, the forged CommSec statements she printed in her Dover Heights office showed miraculous, impossible stability. She told her victims that her brilliant defensive trading strategies had shielded them from the crash. She manipulated them into believing that their money was safer with her than in a physical bank. But the strain was showing. Friends and victims later reported that during 2020, Caddick's demeanor began to shift. The warm, exclusive intimacy she had used to groom them was replaced by defensive hostility. If an investor asked a perfectly reasonable question about a dividend or politely requested a minor withdrawal, she would snap. She would aggressively guilt-trip them, portraying their financial inquiries as a deeply offensive lack of faith in her abilities. She was weaponizing their guilt to buy herself time. She was living in a state of hypervigilance, terrified that a single loose thread would unravel the entire $23 million tapestry. By August 2020, the psychological trap was completely full. Melissa Caddick had successfully stolen the life savings of over 60 people. She had betrayed her parents, her brother, and her closest confidants. She had stolen the financial identity of her former colleague, Jennifer Porter. She had isolated her husband in a golden cage of ignorance. And she had convinced the elite circles of Sydney's eastern suburbs that she was an untouchable, $86 million financial savant. She had built a fortress of lies so towering and so complex that she genuinely believed she was invincible. The sociopathic confidence that had allowed her to walk away from a forged check in 1998 had calcified into absolute arrogance. She believed that no one would ever be smart enough or brave enough to question the 6-digit AFSL number printed on the back of her leather-bound prospectuses. She thought the closed loop was impenetrable, but she was wrong. The flaw in her design wasn't a mathematical error in her forged documents. It wasn't a bank flagging a suspicious transaction. The fatal flaw was the simple, uncontrollable geometry of human coincidence. As winter set in across Sydney in August 2020, a woman named Dominique Ogilvie, one of Caddick's multi-million-dollar victims, walked into an orthodontist's clinic in Edgecliff. She sat down in the waiting room, completely unaware that the woman sitting across from her was about to strike the match that would burn Malaver Petwaiti Limited to the ground. The trap had been perfected, and now it was about to spring shut on the architect herself. Sydney's eastern suburbs occupy a unique geographical and social space. It is a world of sheer sandstone cliffs, multi-million-dollar harbour views, and deeply intertwined social networks. In this enclave, extreme wealth is not just a status symbol, it is the atmospheric pressure. Everyone knows everyone, or at the very least, they share the same accountants, the same private schools, and the same medical specialists. For 7 years, Melissa Caddick had used this tight-knit ecosystem to her absolute advantage. She exploited the incestuous nature of eastern suburbs high society, using personal referrals to build a wall of trust that no outsider could penetrate. But a closed ecosystem is a double-edged sword. When your entire fraudulent empire relies on your victims and your past acquaintances occupying the same small social footprint, the mathematical probability of a catastrophic collision increases every single day. In August 2020, the mathematics finally caught up with Melissa Caddick. The collision did not happen in a boardroom or a courtroom, it happened in the waiting room of an orthodontist's clinic in Edgecliff. Dominique Ogilvie was a highly successful businesswoman. She was astute, globally connected, and financially literate. She was precisely the kind of investor who should have seen through the Malaver facade, but she, like dozens of others, had been subjected to Caddick's masterclass in psychological grooming. Earlier in 2020, Ogilvie had met with Caddick. She had been invited past the velvet rope. She sat in the Dover Heights mansion, absorbed the visual proof of Caddick's immense wealth, and most importantly, she had been handed the leather-bound prospectus containing the 6-digit Australian Financial Services Licence, AFSL, number. Trusting the visual cues of government regulation and the warm, exclusive intimacy Caddick projected, Ogilvy made her decision. She entrusted Melissa Caddick with $2.5 million of her capital. By August, Ogilvy was receiving her flawlessly forged CommSec statements, completely satisfied that her portfolio was thriving under Caddick's supposedly brilliant defensive trading strategies. One winter afternoon, Ogilvy was sitting in an Edgecliff orthodontist's waiting room. The clinic door opened. Walking in from the street was a woman named Jennifer Porter. The two women knew each other socially, moving in the same affluent circles. But Jennifer Porter held a much deeper, hidden significance in this narrative. She was a former colleague of Melissa Caddick from their days working at Wise Financial in the early 2000s. Porter had successfully gone independent and legally obtained her own AFSL for her highly regulated, legitimate financial advisory business. And, entirely unbeknownst to Dominique Ogilvy, Jennifer Porter was the legal owner of the exact AFSL number printed on every single piece of Malaver documentation. In the psychology of a financial mark, the victim genuinely believes they have found a golden ticket. It is an intrinsic human desire to validate that success by sharing it with respected peers. As Ogilvy and Porter exchanged pleasantries in the waiting room, the conversation naturally drifted to business, the economy, and the turbulent state of the markets in the midst of the 2020 pandemic. Ogilvy, thrilled with the supposed returns she was seeing on her forged statements, mentioned that she was currently investing heavily with a mutual acquaintance of theirs, Melissa Caddick. Porter, likely making polite conversation, listened as Ogilvy praised Caddick's financial acumen. Then, Ogilvy added a detail that would act as a psychological detonator. Seeking to validate her multi-million-dollar decision to Porter, a seasoned financial professional, Ogilvy mentioned that she felt completely secure in the investment precisely because she knew Caddick was operating under Porter's financial license. In that single, casual sentence, two vastly different realities violently collided in the quiet waiting room. For Dominique Ogilvy, she was simply confirming a reassuring regulatory fact. She was telling a colleague, "I know my money is safe because she's working under your umbrella." For Jennifer Porter, the sentence was a moment of profound, chilling realization. Porter had not spoken to Melissa Caddick in years. She had certainly never authorized her former colleague to operate under her highly regulated, rigorously audited corporate license. To understand what happened next, you must understand the gravity of an AFSL. In the Australian financial sector, an AFSL is not just a piece of paper, it is a legal tether. If an authorized representative working under your license gives bad advice, breaches compliance, or loses millions of dollars, the regulator does not just punish the representative. ASIC holds the license holder legally and financially responsible. In that waiting room, Jennifer Porter realized she was the victim of massive corporate identity theft. Worse, she was suddenly facing catastrophic legal jeopardy. If Melissa Caddick was moving millions of dollars of client money under Porter's license, Porter's own legitimate business, her reputation, and her personal freedom were on the line. This is the moment where human behavior dictates the course of history. The natural instinct for most people in Porter's position would be fury. The instinct would be to pull out her phone right there in the waiting room, call Melissa Caddick, and demand an explanation. But Porter was a compliance-driven professional. She recognized the sheer scale of the red flag waving in front of her. If an advisor is stealing a license, they are almost certainly stealing the money. If Porter had called Caddick and tipped her off, it would have given the predator time to destroy documents, transfer funds to offshore accounts, or flee the country. Showing immense psychological restraint, Porter did not blow up the spot. She finished the conversation with Ogilvy, left the clinic, and did exactly what the financial system is designed to do. She prepared to go straight to the corporate regulator. In early September 2020, Jennifer Porter formally contacted the Australian Securities and Investments Commission, ASIC. She submitted a whistleblower complaint, clearly outlining that Malaver Pty Limited and Melissa Caddick were fraudulently using her company's financial services license. When a citizen reports a stolen car, the police begin a physical search. But when a financial professional reports a stolen AFSL, ASIC initiates a vastly different protocol. The regulator looks for a ghost. Operating an unlicensed financial services business is a severe federal offense, carrying heavy penalties. But stealing another firm's identity to run an unlicensed business suggests a level of deliberate, calculated deception that points directly to systemic, multi-million-dollar fraud. It is the ultimate corporate red flag. ASIC did not send a cease and desist letter. They did not call Melissa Caddick Limited to ask for clarification. They understood that if Caddick was running a Ponzi scheme, any direct contact would trigger a massive destruction of evidence. Instead, ASIC assembled a strike team. The tip was handed over to a specialized investigative unit led by ASIC investigator Isabella Lucy Allen. For 7 years, Melissa Caddick had been the apex predator. She had controlled every piece of information her victims saw, dictating reality from her Dover Heights mansion. She believed she was untouchable. But as September 2020 began, the power dynamic completely and permanently inverted. Melissa Caddick was now the prey, and she had absolutely no idea she was being hunted. When investigating white-collar crime, the greatest threat to a successful prosecution is time. If a street-level criminal knows the police are coming, they might run. But if a sophisticated financial fraudster knows the regulator is coming, they don't just run, they erase. With a few clicks of a mouse, servers can be wiped, encrypted hard drives can be destroyed, and millions of dollars can be wired through an obfuscated maze of offshore accounts in jurisdictions that refuse to cooperate with Australian authorities. When Jennifer Porter submitted her whistleblower complaint to the Australian Securities and Investments Commission in September 2020, ASIC understood the stakes. Melissa Caddick was allegedly operating a massive, unlicensed wealth management firm using stolen credentials. If ASIC sent a standard compliance letter asking for clarification, they would be handing Caddick the one thing a fraudster needs most: a head start. To catch her, the corporate regulator had to strip away her greatest weapon. They had to take away her control of the narrative. ASIC investigator Isabella Lucy Allen took the lead. She initiated a shadow protocol. For the first time in 7 years, someone was looking at Melissa Caddick Limited, and Melissa Caddick had absolutely no idea. The foundation of any financial audit is the banking data. You cannot rely on the glossy prospectuses or the promises made at dinner parties. You must follow the immutable mathematics of the ledger. Operating in absolute secrecy, Allen and her team utilized their federal powers to compel the production of records. They quietly issued notices to Australia's major financial institutions, primarily focusing on the Commonwealth Bank of Australia, CBA, and the National Australia Bank, NAB, demanding every transaction history, account opening form, and transfer log associated with Melissa Caddick and Melissa Caddick Limited. When the data flooded into ASIC's servers, the investigators began to reconstruct the true architecture of the fraud. What they saw was a staggering inflow of capital. The bank statements revealed that over 60 individuals had transferred vast sums of money into accounts controlled by Caddick. These were not small, speculative gambles. These were life savings, superannuation payouts, and property settlements ranging from tens of thousands to multi-million-dollar deposits. But immediately, a massive, glaring red flag appeared on the ledger. In legitimate wealth management, an advisor rarely touches a client's money directly. The funds are deposited into an independent, third-party custodial trust account. This ensures that if the advisor's company goes bankrupt, or if the advisor is corrupt, the client's money is legally walled off and protected. Isabella Allen's audit revealed that Melissa Caddick used no independent custodians. Every single dollar deposited by her victims flowed directly into everyday bank accounts that Caddick solely controlled. The victim's capital was instantly commingled with her own personal cash flow. The money wasn't walled off, it was sitting in her pocket. Seeing the massive inflow of capital was only the first step. The critical question for ASIC was, what happened next? Caddick's investors genuinely believed their money was safe. If you asked any of the victims in September 2020 where their capital was, they would confidently tell you it was heavily invested in blue-chip Australian shares. They had the paperwork to prove it. Every month, Caddick handed them beautifully printed Commonwealth Bank securities, CommSec statements, detailing their exact stock holdings, dividend yields, and portfolio growth. ASIC had to verify these trades. So, Isabella Allen cross-referenced the names of the Malaver investors and the corporate entities with Australia's major share registries, including CommSec and Link Market Services. The investigators queried the databases, expecting to find a complex, tangled web of high-volume day trading, or perhaps a series of catastrophic market losses that Caddick was trying to cover up. The CommSec verification, the absence of accounts. ASIC asked CommSec to pull the trading accounts for Malaver's investors based on the account numbers printed on the statements Caddick had provided to her victims. CommSec confirmed those accounts did not exist. The registry search, the absence of trades. ASIC searched for any share purchases made under Caddick's name, Malaver's name, or the investors' names. The registries confirmed zero activity. No shares in CSL, no shares in Macquarie Bank, no shares in Woolworths. The mathematical reality, the absolute void. The final calculation was devastating. Of the $23 million deposited into Caddick's accounts, the amount actually invested in the Australian share market was precisely $0.00. It was a moment of profound realization for the ASIC team. The CommSec statements Caddick had been handing to her family and friends for 7 years were not exaggerated. They were absolute fabrications. She had manually typed the numbers onto forged templates. There was no bad investment. There was no market crash. There was no secret no market crash. There was no secret trading algorithm. The entire Malaver wealth management empire was a ghost ship. The discovery of the void presented Allen with a terrifying mathematical problem. If $23 million went into the bank accounts and $0 went into the stock market, where was the money? To answer this, ASIC had to follow the outflow. They transitioned from auditing an investment firm to conducting a forensic lifestyle audit of Melissa Caddick. When they traced the millions flowing out of the Malaver accounts, they didn't find offshore tax havens or complex cryptocurrency wallets. They found luxury retail. The paper trail was undeniable, arrogant, and brutally analog. Isabella Allen watched on the ledger as stolen investor capital was used to pay the mortgage on the $6 million Dover Heights mansion. She saw stolen funds used to purchase high-end Audi sports cars. She traced hundreds of thousands of dollars flowing directly to exclusive private schools, funding an elite education on the backs of defrauded friends. Most sickeningly, the audit revealed the sheer scale of Caddick's vanity. Millions of dollars were traced to luxury boutiques in Sydney's CBD. The victim's life savings had been converted into Christian Dior dresses, Chanel handbags, and bespoke diamond-encrusted jewelry from Canturi. The all-expenses-paid ski trips to Aspen, Colorado, the trips she used to convince her marks of her immense wealth, were funded entirely by the very people sitting next to her in first class. By late October, the shadow investigation was complete. Isabella Allen had mapped the entire anatomy of the beast. She had the whistleblower complaint proving the stolen AFSL. She had the bank statements proving the commingling of funds. She had the registry data proving the absolute lack of share trading. And she had the financial footprint proving the money was incinerated on high-end luxury. ASIC now possessed a weapon that Melissa Caddick's psychological manipulations could not defeat. An immutable paper trail. Allen began drafting a master affidavit. This document would synthesize months of covert forensic accounting into a single, devastating narrative of fraud. It was the legal torpedo that would finally sink Malaver Propriety Limited. The shadow protocol was over. It was time to bring the investigation into the light, and time to spring the trap on the architect of the illusion. There is a profound, almost terrifying dissonance that occurs in the final days of a successful covert investigation. In early November 2020, Melissa Caddick was living exactly as she had for the past 7 years. She was the undisputed queen of her manufactured reality. She was waking up in her Dover Heights mansion, wearing bespoke jewelry, and walking her friends through entirely fabricated ComSec portfolios, showing millions of dollars in fictional returns. In her mind, she was untouchable. But just a few miles away, in the sterile, fluorescent-lit offices of the Australian Securities and Investments Commission in Sydney's CBD, her reality had already been dismantled. The psychological trap she had built to ensnare her victims had been entirely bypassed by an immutable paper trail. ASIC did not care about her Dior dresses or her confident demeanour. They only cared about the math, and the math proved that Malava Pituitary Limited was a $23 million vacuum. It was time to spring the trap. Before the corporate regulator can tear down a multi-million-dollar business and freeze a citizen's assets, they must present absolute, irrefutable proof to the judiciary. On Monday, November 9th, 2020, ASIC investigator Isabella Lucy Allen finalized that proof. She affirmed a massive, highly detailed primary affidavit. In the legal world, an affidavit is a sworn statement of fact. But in the context of the Malava case, Isabella Allen's affidavit was something much more profound. It was the translation of Melissa Caddick's 7 years of sociopathic manipulation into cold, hard, legal arithmetic. The document laid out the entire anatomy of the fraud. It detailed the whistleblower tip from Jennifer Porter regarding the stolen Australian Financial Services Licence, AFSL. It mapped the massive inflow of capital from over 60 victims into Caddick's personal accounts. It presented the devastating confirmation from the share registries that no stocks had ever been purchased. And it traced the stolen millions directly into luxury retail, overseas holidays, and real estate. The affidavit was the antithesis of everything Caddick had built. Caddick thrived on ambiguity, emotional manipulation, and the halo effect. The affidavit was entirely devoid of emotion. It was a mathematical guillotine, and the blade was finally raised. The following day, Tuesday, November 10th, ASIC lawyers took Isabella Allen's affidavit and walked into the Federal Court of Australia. They appeared before Justice Jaggett. Crucially, this hearing was held ex parte. In the Australian legal system, an ex parte hearing means that the subject of the legal action, in this case Melissa Caddick, is deliberately excluded. She was not invited. She was not informed it was happening. She had no legal representation in the room to defend her. This secrecy is reserved for extreme circumstances. If ASIC had notified Caddick that they were taking her to the federal court for running an unlicensed Ponzi scheme, she would have had hours, perhaps days, to react. A fraudster with a $23 million shortfall and advanced warning is a severe flight risk. Given her history of abruptly fleeing the UK in 2012 when her first marriage collapsed, ASIC knew Caddick had the psychological capacity to simply vanish. She could have transferred remaining funds to untraceable offshore accounts, destroyed the forged ComSec templates on her hard drives, and boarded an international flight before the ink on the court orders was dry. Justice Jaggett reviewed the ASIC affidavit. The evidence was overwhelming. The judge recognized the immediate existential threat to the investors' remaining capital and the high probability of evidence destruction. Without hesitation, the federal court granted the orders. What Justice Jaggett signed that day was not an arrest warrant. It was something that, to a fraudster obsessed with control and wealth, is arguably much worse. It was a mandate for total economic and physical paralysis. Economic decapitation, the asset freeze. The court ordered an immediate, comprehensive freeze on every asset connected to Melissa Caddick and Malava Pituitary Limited. She was legally barred from withdrawing, transferring, or hiding a single cent from her bank accounts. She could not sell her cars. She could not mortgage her house. Her financial oxygen supply was instantly cut off. Physical containment, the travel ban. The court explicitly prohibited Caddick from leaving Australia. She was ordered to surrender all passports and travel documents to the authorities immediately upon being served. The court summons, the ultimatum. Finally, the orders commanded Caddick to physically appear before the federal court just days later. She was ordered to provide a full, sworn accounting of her assets and explain exactly where the missing millions had gone. By the afternoon of November 10th, the legal web was perfectly spun. Melissa Caddick was entirely trapped, yet she remained completely oblivious to her own demise. As the sun set over Sydney, Caddick was likely sitting in her Dover Heights mansion, perhaps planning her next luxury holiday or printing the latest batch of forged statements for her victims. She was still the master of her universe, but across the city, ASIC and the Australian Federal Police, AFP, were holding tactical briefings. They were reviewing the floor plans of the Wollongongo Road property. They were coordinating marked vehicles, evidence bags, and forensic IT specialists. The invisible tripwire had been triggered months ago in an orthodontist's waiting room. The shadow investigation had successfully mapped the void. The federal court had signed the warrants. The quiet phase of the investigation was over. Tomorrow morning, at 6 a.m., the authorities were going to kick down the door of her reality. There is a profound psychological phenomenon that occurs at the absolute apex of a successful fraud. It is a form of sociopathic blindness. When a predator operates with total impunity for 7 years, the human brain begins to rewire itself. The fear of getting caught, which acts as a survival mechanism for a petty thief, completely atrophies in the mind of a multi-million-dollar con artist. Melissa Caddick had stolen over $23 million. She had looked her parents, her brother, and her closest friends in the eye and handed them forged documents, and she had never faced a single consequence. Because the ecosystem she built was completely devoid of resistance, she had convinced herself that she was the smartest person in any room she walked into. She believed her own myth. But as the sun set over Sydney on Tuesday, November 10th, 2020, that myth had only hours left to live. The invisible tripwire had been triggered, the shadow investigation had verified the void, and the federal court had armed the trap. The evening of November 10th represents one of the most chilling juxtapositions in Australian criminal history. At the $6 million mansion on Wollongongo Road in Dover Heights, the evening was remarkably mundane. According to the timeline established during the coronial inquest, there was no panic inside the Caddick-Colletti household. There were no frantic phone calls to offshore banks. There were no suitcases being packed in the dead of night. Melissa Caddick went about her evening completely oblivious to the fact that she was legally, financially, and physically trapped. Her husband, Anthony Colletti, remained in his engineered state of ignorance, surrounded by the luxury paid for by the stolen life savings of their friends. To Caddick, November 10th was just another Tuesday. She went to sleep believing that tomorrow she would wake up, put on her designer activewear, and continue to reign over her empire. But a few miles away, a vastly different reality was mobilizing. At the headquarters of the Australian Federal Police, AFP, and the Australian Securities and Investments Commission, ASIC, there was no sleep. The successful execution of an ex parte freezing order and a massive search warrant requires absolute precision. If a raid is poorly coordinated, the target can lock a computer, swallow a thumb drive, or delete a cloud server in a matter of seconds. A sick investigator. Isabella Lucy Allen and the AFP strike team spent the evening finalizing the operational matrix. They reviewed the floor plans of the multi-level Dover Heights property. They designated specific roles: officers to secure the perimeter, agents to serve the federal court orders, and forensic IT specialists to immediately isolate and seize Caddick's electronic devices before she could trigger any data wiping protocols. They were preparing to dismantle a 7-year illusion in a matter of hours. They knew that when they knocked on the door, they would not be facing a hardened cartel boss. They would be facing a suburban mother who had never experienced a single moment of genuine accountability in her adult life. The psychological shock of that impact was going to be catastrophic. As midnight passed, rolling into the early hours of Wednesday, November 11th, the Malaver Ponzi scheme existed in its final, terminal state. For the victims sleeping in their homes across the eastern suburbs, their millions were already gone, incinerated on Dior, Chanel, and Aspen ski trips, but they didn't know it yet. For Anthony Coletti, his life as the pampered husband of a financial genius was over, but he didn't know it yet. And for Melissa Caddick, the sociopathic confidence that had insulated her since she forged her first check in 1998 was about to be violently shattered. The invisible tripwire had done its job. The corporate regulator had followed the paper trail through the darkness, entirely bypassing the psychological defenses Caddick had spent decades building. The trap was now sitting right outside her front door. All that was left was for the sun to rise and for the heavy boots of the Australian Federal Police to march up the driveway.